أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين فاطر السماوات والأرضين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today, inshallah, we will look briefly at Surah Al-Mutaffifin, the chapter which describes those people who commit fraud, who are fraudulent in their buying and selling and in their commercial transactions. And it's a very interesting surah. Different ahadith indicate that this surah pertains particularly to the enemies of Ahlul Bayt and the friends of Ahlul Bayt or the lovers of Ahlul Bayt in terms of their actions and in terms of their essence and their created substance from which they were created, their created reality. And so Surah Al-Mutaffifin is an interesting surah. But before we talk about the tafsir of specific verses, I will read just the few opening verses of this chapter and then describe how, according to a hadith, it was originally revealed. Now, I've mentioned before that the revelation of the verses of the Quran is not a limitation for us to think that this is what it is really referring to or it's primarily referring to. But it is a good starting place, and it often gives us very valuable lessons. But we don't want to be limited to the sha'n al-nuzul, the original occasion why a verse was revealed. So in this surah, Allah begins by saying, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَيْلٌ لِلْمُطَفِّفِينَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا اكْتَالُوا عَلَى النَّاسِ يَسْتَوْفُونَ وَإِذَا كَالُوهُمْ أَوْ وَزَنُوهُمْ يُخْسِرُونَ. That wail, and right now I won't translate the word wail. Wail is for the mutaffifin. We'll translate in just a minute. Wail belongs to the mutaffifin, those who commit fraud in their interactions and in their transactions. The attribute that the Quran mentions is twofold. Number one, that when they want to buy something from somebody, then they make sure that they're looking at the scale carefully and that they're not deprived of even a part of their right. So if they're measuring, for example, a kilogram of grains, they want to make sure that they get the full kilogram and that there's not even 1 gram, 5 grams that's missing from what they want to receive. But then if the tables are turned and they're on the other side of the table and they're selling, then they're not quite so careful to make sure that they give the customer more than that customer deserves. And they will say that, well, let us try to take advantage, and yukhsirun. They make the other person suffer a loss. So istifa when I'm taking, and ikhsar or making somebody else suffer a loss when I am giving. That is the attribute of the mutaffifin. Now, according to the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, whenever the Quran says wail, it is actually a condemnation to hellfire. This is a place within hellfire that the unbelievers will go. And so according to the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt, if the Quran says wail, it's not just the literal meaning which is alas or woe be to these people. That's how we typically translate it. Woe be to those who commit fraud. But it's not just alas, it's not just woe, but it is saying that these people, they might look and talk like believers. They might be perceived by others as mu'mineen. And they might even perceive themselves as believers. But they belong to that low place of torment and punishment within the hellfire. Wail is a condemnation to punishment. So that's one point. The second point is, where were these verses first mentioned by the Prophet? According to a hadith from Ahlul Bayt, it was when the Prophet first came to Medina. And when he came to Medina, this was a Prophet fleeing Mecca. And you all know the story of the Hijrah. This was not a case where the Prophet had many different options. The whole world was welcoming him. He could have gone to Iraq, he could have gone to Sham, he could have gone to Yemen, he could have gone to Ta'if, he could have gone to Eastern Arabia, and he said that, let me go to Medina, but I have certain conditions. The Prophet was fleeing Mecca under the threat of assassination, and he had already been turned away by many of the tribes and the other cities in the vicinity, particularly in Ta'if. And so the Prophet was coming to Medina in a precarious and in a vulnerable position. However, the people of Medina who did bay'ah to the Prophet, they had also seen and heard some of the teachings of the Prophet. So he was coming in order to be a peacemaker and to settle disputes, and also to have the freedom to preach Islam. But it was not a city that the Prophet had given any conditions to, that I will come if you meet these conditions. In a sense, he was a refugee, and he was seeking refuge in Medina to people who had heard his message. So he was coming to people who had heard his message, who had accepted his role as a peacemaker, but many of them were not Muslims. They had not yet pledged to fight for him or to defend him. And many of them, the majority, had not yet even pledged to accept him as a prophet. So if that were the situation, what do you think the priorities of the Prophet should be? Or maybe more immediately for our own consideration, what would our priorities be if we were to be with the Prophet at that time? In many cases, the conception that we have of Islam, the conception that we have of Islamic values, that will show up when we decide where to think and where to spend our time and where to devote our energies and our talents. What is most important? So in that circumstance, the Prophet wants to establish Islam. He wants the people of Medina to understand what is Islam, and he wants them to accept that message. He comes and he looks at the city and he says that, I notice that there is no standard of weights and measures. And in Medina, the reason why people could commit that fraud is because every storekeeper had maybe a brick, maybe a rock, maybe a mold that they had made, and they had a scale. When they would want to sell something, they would put their weight, their standard, on the scale, and they would measure according to it. It's very easy, if there is no strong central authority who's checking and making sure that the weights and measures are standardized and that they are fair, it's very easy for every storekeeper to say that, well, I'll have 2 sets. One will be a little bit more than a kilogram, and that'll be what I want to use when I am receiving from my suppliers. And one will be a little bit less than a kilogram, it's 980 grams. That's the one that I will use when I'm selling. I'll claim that it's a kilogram. And so the Prophet, entering into Medina, he's, yes, a peacemaker and he has that kind of a role, but doesn't have any kind of actual police force at his disposal, any kind of political office at his disposal. There is a Jewish population, there is a mushrik population, there is a very small Muslim population, and many of those Muslims are muhajirin. Muhajirin is actually refugees and not migrants. And so he begins by a campaign against injustice in trade. Who are the addressees of the Prophet at this time? Mostly non-Muslims. It would be the Jews, and it would be the mushrikeen who had control of the market. First of all, too few people from Medina had accepted Islam for them to be the main people the Prophet is addressing. And second of all, those who had come from Makkah, many of them did have some assets. Some of them were even wealthy, but they were not able to bring their wealth. They had to leave it in Makkah and abandon it when they came to Medina. And so if they had a small corner of some market where they could begin to trade, then it was somebody's charity that they had said, you can take a little bit of my land and you can use it to set up shop. So the people the Prophet was addressing were non-Muslims. Many of them actually unfavorably disposed towards Islam. And this was one of the first campaigns of the Prophet in Medina. وَيْلٌ لِلْمُطَفِّفِينَ. That those who are unjust, they are going to be punished in the hereafter. This is not a secular concern. This is a tragedy of our modern life, that our religious concerns have been made narrow, and this type of an issue, we say, well, I need a strong state. I need a bureau of weights and measures. I need a strong legal system and a judicial system so that I can make sure that I can get my right. That's a secular concern. It's not a religious concern. But for the Prophet, that is a moral and a religious concern. And it's not because I'm afraid of being sued, but it's because I'm afraid of having to live eternity in wail that I want to be fair to other people. And this kind of a conception of morality and religion is what allowed the Prophet to be able to be successful in spreading Islam to Medina. If he had just said that I have one little small compartment of your life, 1 day a week, and the extra time that you have in leisure, that's where my religion is going to be relevant to you, then Islam would not have spread like wildfire in Medina. Islam would not have become the conscience of the city before it became the religion of the city. Islam became the conscience of Medina before Islam became the religion of the people of Medina. And this was one of the ways that the Prophet was able to speak to Muslims and non-Muslims. And it's very important for us as Muslims to consider this to be a core part of our religious values and our religious preachings. That injustice, that oppression, that the misallocation of resources, any kind of taking advantage of somebody by another person who has more power, that is against Islam. When there is a society with a great deal of inequality, when there is a society with a great deal of concentration of wealth and resources, or when there is a society when people in different areas of their life are being dealt with unfairly, that is a concern for us as Muslims. Unfortunately, in our Muslim communities, it doesn't show up, because Muslims are concerned only about maybe certain foreign affairs, certain political issues, and maybe a small number of issues that directly concern our religious practice. But this is also our religious practice, and it is part of our message for society. So that's the point that we can derive from the revelation of these verses. But as we said, the extension is much broader than that. So this principle, إِذَا اكْتَالُوا عَلَى النَّاسِ يَسْتَوْفُونَ وَإِذَا كَالُوهُمْ أَوْ وَزَنُوهُمْ يُخْسِرُونَ, that is a very general principle, not related just to buying and selling. Anytime I want to get more than I give, then I am doing a form of this tatfif, which the Quran condemns. So for example, if I would like you to judge me by my intentions, but I judge you by your actions. Might just be with me talking to my own family members, or it might be in the masjid, that I bring an excuse that I meant well, even if I made a mistake. But then when I deal with you, I say, I don't care what you meant or what you intended, you didn't do this right, and I judge you harshly. So, yastawfun for themselves, يُخْسِرُونَ for others. If I want my children to be judged on a grade, that yes, they're running around a little bit, but kids will be kids. Yes, they did maybe not fully respect the masjid property, but kids will be kids. What are you going to do? Then when it's somebody else's children, all of a sudden this becomes a major issue. That why is it that these people don't discipline their children? So this is in the community setting that we have, that for myself, all of my rights should be preserved. But for other people, then keep them on a short leash. And we can see many different areas in our families, in our professional relationships, in our community centers, where this is a problem. And it sucks the life and the grace and the kindness and the generosity out of our interactions. That is something which the Quran condemns. So don't think of it just as an economic message. Don't think of it just as a message about when you go to the market. And these days, most of us, we use a credit card to buy, and we buy pre-packaged things, so it's almost irrelevant. I'm pretty sure many of our younger community members have never seen a scale, and they wouldn't know how to use it if they did see it. Maybe even some of our older community members. It doesn't mean that this surah has become any less relevant. In fact, it is as relevant or more relevant in our lives because there is a weakness of the nafs, of the soul, that causes a person to act that way. And then when it shows up in commerce, that's just one, and maybe not even the most important extension of that attribute that comes from a weakness of the soul. So what is the solution that the Quran gives? It says, أَلَا يَظُنُّ أُولَٰئِكَ أَنَّهُمْ مَبْعُوثُونَ لِيَوْمٍ عَظِيمٍ. Don't those people think that they are going to be resurrected for a great day? Now the word that the Quran uses, أَلَا يَظُنُّ أُولَٰئِكَ أَنَّهُمْ مَبْعُوثُونَ, is a little bit odd. Dhan, as many of you are familiar, it's usually used in our common speech when we say to think something. I suspect, I suppose, I think. And is it a supposition that is going to cure us of that affliction? Alaikum salam. Or is it a certainty or a knowledge? Certainty or the knowledge. There are certain truths that we have to know, and we have to actually appreciate that Yawmuddin is more real than our actual existence, our actual superficial life. That's why if I have a good intention, it will show up in the hereafter. It might not show up in this world. So which one is more real, more accurate, more present? It's the hereafter. So why would the Quran say يَظُنُّ أُولَٰئِكَ and not, for example, يَسْتَيْقِنُ or يُوقِنُ? Those are the words that refer to certainty. So a hadith have told us that this does mean yaqeen. It's referring to yaqeen. But maybe the reason why the Quran uses dhan is because in the Quran, dhan does not simply mean supposition. Dhan is kind of that snap judgment, that visceral reaction that you make, which is so innate to you that it cannot be separated from you. Oftentimes it's a supposition, and oftentimes it's unjustified. إِنَّ الظَّنَّ لَا يُغْنِي مِنَ الْحَقِّ شَيْئًا. That if you just have a supposition, a visceral reaction, that might not be accurate, it might not be fair, it could be a prejudice. And that's not going to suffice you in place of haqq. But you need to actually examine, think, and find out what is right. But in some cases, we want to try to develop a level of certainty that we don't even need to think about it. It's just something that's innate within us. So for example, if I were to think about it, I would be able to probably even give a very good argument for why my mother loves me. Because I can think of incidents, and I can think of things that she has said, and I can give a great deal of evidence and proof that my mother loves me in a way that nobody else would be able to love me. But is that really the basis of my relationship with my mother? Do I need to say that, wait, let me think. Yes, I do have a good argument. Yes, she does love me. I do have the yaqeen, and the yaqeen is there. But there is a dhan, a snap judgment, a visceral judgment, an innate knowledge that is rooted in that yaqeen, is rooted in my experience, and that is actually the much more present element in my relationship with my mother. And it needs to be there. If I strip that away, and I just operate on the basis of what is understood and what is known through the intellect and rationality, then something is lost in that relationship, the power of it. And so perhaps the Quran is actually saying here that although it is yaqeen we're referring to, we don't want you to think of it as just being a certainty that you know. It should be a visceral reaction. It should be part of your very being. That every time I'm standing with you and I want to say something rude, I want to say something unfair, I want to tell a lie, I want to maybe treat you unjustly in a transaction, before I even think that there is a day of judgment, I feel that there is a day of judgment. The Quran wants that to be present in every fiber of our being. We feel it, we know it, we believe it. It's that dhan which is inseparable from us. So the supposition here is not weaker than certainty, but it's stronger than certainty. So this is a question the Quran asks. Don't they think that they're going to be resurrected for a great day? The day when people will stand before their Lord? يَوْمَ يَقُومُ النَّاسُ لِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. And hadith say that this verse means that when people stand for the Day of Judgment, it'll be like arrows packed into a quiver, where you can't move. You're just standing at attention, accounting for your actions. Now the Quran moves on after that image, and then it says that there are two types of creation, and this is where the Quran talks about creation of people. It does so by talking about the book that Allah will give us of our actions. كَلَّا إِنَّ كِتَابَ الْفُجَّارِ لَفِي سِجِّينٍ وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا سِجِّينٍ. That the book of actions of the fujjar, the openly sinful, that's in Sijjin. And then the Quran says that what will you know what is Sijjin? Kitabun marqum. It's not really defining Sijjin. The Quran says that, how can I tell you what is Sijjin? And it doesn't really fully answer that question, or it doesn't directly answer that question because we can't understand it. It says that this kitab is a kitabun marqum. It's written. Everything that we have done, good and bad, is recorded. We will have to answer for it. Even if we live our life as an insightful person, then we can see some of the elements of that hisab and that kitaba in our own life. It's not that we can pass through life without accounting for and atoning for our actions. If we see that in our life, then in the hereafter it will be a complete and a full accounting and a full atoning. So the Quran doesn't fully describe it, but ahadith do. They say that Sijjin is kind of the lowest earth. So if you imagine that there is an earth, and then there is a lower earth beneath it, and then a lower earth beneath it, and then a lower earth beneath it, then that lowest earth, that is Sijjin. And then later on, the Quran says, كَلَّا إِنَّ كِتَابَ الْأَبْرَارِ لَفِي عِلِّيِّينَ وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا عِلِّيُّونَ. That the book of the abrar, the doers of good, that will be in Illiyin. And so that is the highest heaven. Now that image is used by the Quran to describe where our book is. And ahadith say that that is actually where you also come from. So Ahlul Bayt say that we were created from that substance of Illiyin. And our lovers, they were created from our substance. Their qulub are from Illiyin, and their bodies are from just a little bit below that. And so there is a tension in our existence. our body needs to work and it aspires to try to reach a higher state. We have to work to try to become close to Ahlul Bayt. And the A'da and the enemies of Ahlul Bayt, they were created from the substance of Sijjin. And they will return to it. Their followers, those who choose misguidance, they are also created from something that is derived from Sijjin. There is a hadith that tells us that when an unbeliever dies, that soul of the unbeliever, it first tries to go to the heavens. And the heavens say that, no, you can't come here. And then that soul of the unbeliever goes to the earth. And the earth says that you don't have any place here either, you can't go here. And then it goes down and down and down until it comes to Sijjin. And the soul of the unbeliever resides then in Sijjin. And what this hadith and the hadith about the creation of the Shia and the lovers of Ahlul Bayt and the enemies and the A'da of Ahlul Bayt, what these hadith tell us is that there is a gradation within creation. There is a gradation within creation, and that gradation, it shows up both spiritually and physically. And the spirit and the body are going to be united. And so you don't actually have to send out a space probe to say where is Sijjin and where is Illiyin. Because the Quran is not just describing, as some people, maybe hundreds of years ago, they thought that there is actually 7 earths, and the lowest earth is Sijjin. The Quran is describing a reality that is both spiritual and physical. And just as people who are unbelievers and enemies of Ahlul Bayt have lowered their soul to the most bottom level, they've lowered also their body, and that will be reunited at that lowest level of creation. The lowest level of creation is lowest because it is furthest from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the attributes of that which is lowest is that it is removed from God's mercy. So when we're saying about lowest and highest, it's not just imagery, but it's removed from Allah. And it's the most undifferentiated. So as things become more complex, they have more ability to perceive. They have more ability to enjoy. Just imagine, for example, that you have a sumptuous meal in front of you for iftar, and it has so many different kinds of fragrances and spices and different ingredients within it. And imagine for a moment that you've burned your tongue, or you have a very stuffed nose, and so you're not able to smell. That changes your ability to appreciate food. You can't appreciate all of the nuance within that food because you're not able to taste it. You're not able to smell it. And you might not be able to see it. For example, if your eyesight is also blocked. So the more removed you are, the less you are able to appreciate. The lower you are physically, the less you can appreciate in sense of the physical world. And the lower you are spiritually, the less you can understand and appreciate and enjoy spiritual blessings. And the return of the unbelievers to there is, in one way, a reminder that those are united. Lowest physically, lowest spiritually. That is the attribute of the unbelievers. And this is why the Quran says that one of the punishments of the unbelievers is إِنَّهُمْ عَنْ رَبِّهِمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ لَمَحْجُوبُونَ إِنَّهُمْ عَنْ رَبِّهِمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ لَمَحْجُوبُونَ. They're curtained off, veiled from their Lord on the Day of Judgment. So Sijjin is what veils a person from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're unable to see, perceive, and be able to connect to Him. Now, this verse is very interesting because it's describing the punishment of the unbelievers. And the first punishment is hijab or hajb, to be veiled from Allah. And then the Quran says, ثُمَّ إِنَّهُمْ لَصَالُ الْجَحِيمِ. And then they will go to hellfire. That we sometimes think that the greatest punishment is that you can be burned in hellfire. But let me read the verses again and we can see the nuance that the Quran wants to give us. كَلَّا إِنَّهُمْ عَنْ رَبِّهِمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ لَمَحْجُوبُونَ ثُمَّ إِنَّهُمْ لَصَالُ الْجَحِيمِ. They're shielded from their Lord. They won't be able to have the closeness to Allah and to the people of Allah, and then they'll also go to hellfire. Imagine in our time if we tell somebody that if you don't pass this test, then you're not going to get a company of your teacher at graduation, you won't be able to sit on the stage, and you're also going to be tortured for a long time. The student will forget the company and they'll remember the torture. The Quran wants us to think of it though in reverse. That not having that divine company is the true punishment. And Jahannam, Jahim, that's the afterthought. Now, the Quran mentions Jahim because the Quran knows that psychologically for most of us, we'll say, if I don't get to see the divine company, I don't get to be in the company of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt and all of the pious men and women of history, no big deal. But we are motivated by Jahim. But the Quran wants us to change that and to motivate ourselves by love for Allah and desire for that company. It's a bit of an aspiration, inshallah, for us. Final ayah that I will discuss is the verse just before that, in Surah Al-Mutaffifin, verse number 14. We have كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. This has been recited in two ways, Balrana or Barrana, and the Quran that we have, Hafs and Asim, I believe alone among the Qurra, he pauses after Bal. Kalla Bal Rana ala qulubihim ma kanu yaksibun. Whatever they have earned has overcome their hearts. And Imam Baqir alayhi salatu wasalam has a hadith in which he describes what that means. He says that there is in the heart of every person, in the qalb of every person, there is a white space. And when a person commits a sin, there is a darkness that comes over that bright, white part of the soul or the heart. If a person does istighfar, then it can be cleaned. But if a person continues to do sins, then those black dots, those dark spots, they begin to take over the brightness of the heart. Then the Imam says that a time comes that the darkness covers the entire heart. And the Imam says that ثُمَّ لَا يَرْجِعُ إِلَىٰ خَيْرٍ أَبَدًا. If that happens, then a person will never be able to do istighfar and come back. It eventually becomes something that is so part of a human being that you have al-izzatu bil-ithn, you have pride in your sinfulness. That becomes your identity, it becomes your personality. So the Imam is saying that this is referring to the fact that we should be very careful. Allah gives us the opportunity to do istighfar. He doesn't expect us to be perfect. But we have to be aware that there is a point of no return. If you come, and in the olden days people sometimes used to have these games where they would do daredevil activities. They might drive and try to see who can come closest to the cliff before braking. If you try that, and you shouldn't, but if you do, then there might be a point of no return. At which point, even if you brake, by the time the car stops, you'll be over the cliff. That is what this is saying. Rana ala qulubihim ma kanu yaksibun alaykum assalam. You're going to have that momentum that you cannot stop. You will not be able to do istighfar. The Quran, however, is explicitly saying this is free will. Because yaksibun, they earned it. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them that result. So it's not that Allah is preventing them from doing istighfar. That kasb has become so much that now it has become who they are. And that's what the surah ends with. فَالْيَوْمَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنَ الْكُفَّارِ يَضْحَكُونَ عَلَى الْأَرَائِكِ يَنْظُرُونَ هَلْ ثُوِّبَ الْكُفَّارُ مَا كَانُوا يَفْعَلُونَ. The unbelievers, they're just given what they did. Allah does not punish them at all. Allah is not adding anything. He is not harsh. He is not mean. He's just saying, you sent this, you earned this. هَلْ ثُوِّبَ الْكُفَّارُ مَا كَانُوا يَفْعَلُونَ. The believers will see that they are given what they earned. And Allah will, with justice and with fairness, give that to the unbelievers. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we not be among the mutaffifeen, neither in our economic and commercial transactions, nor in our interpersonal relationships, and nor in any other of our affairs. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.